Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Deb. And thank you for having me. And thank you to you all for joining us today evening to talk about arms control. We've got a number of different issues to talk about in this broader world of arms control and non-proliferation. What I would like to do is sort of talk about arms control in the first half of the talk, and also loop in some thoughts about China, where we are at with their nuclear program, and then sort of kind of try to pivot back. I'm not sure if it's pivoting back necessarily, but find ourselves in Iran and talk a little bit about what's going on with the potential negotiations that are going on, and in some ways, how should we think about this, right? Now, I may not have the answers. What I'm hoping is that I can at least provide some framing information, which should ideally provide for questions. And we can dive into, after about a 30-minute-ish talk, we can dive right into sort of pulling out some of the threads that I've provided in the first part of the talk. All right, so with that, let's dive right in. So as Richard mentioned, February 5th, earlier this month, the last arms control treaty between the United States and Russia expired. Right now, this treaty was the New START treaty. It was negotiated and it came into effect in 2011 under the Obama administration. It was extended in 2021 for 5 years, and now it has expired. There was no mechanism for it to be renewed again, which means that really there was, short of negotiating a new agreement, there wasn't a way to actually just extend this. Now, what does that mean? It means that we are now in a world where you have no limits on any country developing, or not any country, any nuclear country developing more nuclear weapons, especially the United States and the Russians sort of developing more nuclear weapons. So there's a question of how did we get here, right? We got here through a set of events which I would argue does not necessarily start with the Trump administration. We got here through a string of events at the turn of the century, which led to a systematic breakdown and moving away from international agreements, which has now brought us here, right? So, precursor, the first sort of a treaty that was unraveled was the ABM Treaty of 1972. Now, some of you may be aware the ABM Treaty of 1972 basically was negotiated between Richard Nixon and Brezhnev, and it agreed that there would be no nationwide deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems. And the idea here was to curb the strategic offensive arms race, right? To curb the number of missiles that both countries, in this case the Soviet Union and the United States, were developing, to make sure that they were able to remain somewhat vulnerable to each other, so that something called mutually assured deterrence, which we better know as MAD, would be in place, right? So this was a way of trying to make the Cold War somewhat safer. Now, Washington, the United States, withdrew from this treaty in 2002. Under George Bush's administration, it was argued that there were fears of rogue states having ballistic missiles which might attack the United States, and as a result, the issue of arms control between the United States and Russia was not quite as important anymore to this administration. At this point in time in the world, they're worried about terrorists, they're worried about loose nuclear weapons, they're worried about missile technology in the hands of terrorists, right? So at this point, the United States withdraws from this treaty. There's no consensus with Russia. Russia did not agree to withdraw from this treaty or change this treaty necessarily, and so the United States said, well, we'll withdraw, right? This is a unilateral action, and as a result of this withdrawal, what starts happening is that the United States can now build anti-ballistic missile systems at a scale that it was not able to do. Technology development as well as collaborations across the road with our European partners, as well as deployments of this technology basically in closer to Eastern Europe as well as in the Mediterranean, leads Russia to think that some of this is in fact aimed towards Russia. Right now, this will pop up again in a little bit for us when we start talking about the New START treaty, but this is the first sort of step in my book towards this unraveling of arms control that we're seeing today. Right? Next, the next step happens somewhat about, like, let's say 15 years later, give or take. And this is the unraveling of the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty, again, some of you might know, 1987, it's this moment of arms control led by Ronald Reagan and Premier Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. And the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, basically decides to eliminate all ground-launched ballistic missiles within the range of 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. So basically all these weapons in this medium range which had nuclear weapons, which were missiles that were tipped with nuclear weapons pointing at each other, they were eliminated, right? Massive step for arms control. First step towards a nuclear-free world, according to Reagan and Gorbachev, right? This step, of course, gets undone. There are a set of violations that take place that the Russians undertake between 2014 and 2017. There was an agreement within the INF Treaty to not possess, produce, or flight test certain types of technologies that would be able to contribute to an intermediate range missile system. The Russians violated that. Something called the Novator 9M729 missile was developed by the Russians, and that was in breach of the INF agreement, according to the United States. And this is happening under, to some extent, the last years of the Obama administration, but really the decision to withdraw from this treaty entirely happens under the first Trump administration. So 2018, the United States withdraws from the INF treaty, right? So this was, again, a major treaty that could potentially have seen forms of cooperation and technical assessments, as well as verifiable checks, etc., being done by the United States on Russia or Russia on the United States. These mechanisms all collapsed, right? So 2018 is when this treaty unravels. And so what you have left is the New START treaty. The New START treaty was negotiated through 2008 to 2010, and then 2010 is when it is signed. It's ratified in Senate and Congress, and this treaty basically said, now you've got to remember, before I tell you what this treaty had, which you can see on the screen here, we're talking about a world which in 1990, around the time that the Soviet Union collapses, the world had about 58,000 nuclear weapons. Right? And this is coming down from the 75,000-ish nuclear weapons that the world had in the mid-80s, right? Now, we have, in 2010, come down to this number of, well, the total number is bigger than this, but it's still a pretty small number. In today's world, adhering to these numbers, we have about 12,000 nuclear weapons in total, okay? Now, the New START treaty was crucial towards coming down to that number of 12,000 from that high number of 56 to 58,000 when the Cold War sort of finished. Now, the New START treaty basically agrees that the United States and Russia both will have 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads, and they will have ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and ground bombers, only 800 of them each. And within that 800, they will only have 700 of these systems deployed. Right? This is a major agreement. It's a major sort of confidence-building measure. It's a major move towards a peaceful world where a smaller number of nuclear weapons are in fact deployed. This treaty has an entire set of verification and compliance mechanisms. These mechanisms allowed United States inspectors to go into Russia to check missiles. It allowed Russian inspectors to come into the United States and check missiles. Right? This system then, of course, starts unraveling around that 2017 period. Around 2017, and mind you, you should remember that February 2021 was the cutoff date for this treaty to expire. So around 2017, you have Putin ask for an extension of this treaty. At this point in time, President Trump calls the New START treaty a bad deal. Now, as a result, what starts happening is that there starts to be friction between the United States and Russia on what they consider to be doable within this treaty, right? So now Russia announces within this period, 2019, and this is something that led to the unraveling of INF earlier already, Russia announces the development of new nuclear delivery systems. And in the meanwhile, President Trump wants China to be within this arms control agreement. Now, we're starting to reach an impasse here, right? So by 2019, President Trump not only wants China in these extension talks, he also says that any treaty that the United States and Russia has should not only include China, but should include all weapons, all the warheads, and all the missiles. Now, this is gunning for a lot. Now, this should be no surprise to you, of course, that as a result of this position, the treaty starts, the extension becomes a very big question. By 2019, Russia proposes that, look, maybe we can't get to new things. Why don't we just extend this treaty as is for a year? Right? The United States at that point in time is not interested in this. The US starts making proposals for a political binding treaty. It again has a set of talks with Russia, and this time round it actually in 2020 there was this photo, I don't know if some of you followed this, there was an empty chair around a table, and the chair, in front of the chair was a Chinese flag, right? And of course China was like, wait, what are we doing here? But the United States was like, look, we cannot have a serious conversation without China at the table. Of course, there was theatrics, it was a lot of optics, but it told you where the United States was at that point in time with regard to arms control. Of course, then we have the elections in the United States. President Biden comes in, and for President Biden and the Democratic government that's in place, even during the transition period, negotiations start, and by February of 2021, which was the cutoff date, a few days before the cutoff date, the United States and Russia agree that they will have a 5-year extension as is of the treaty that exists, right? So that really is the last step. What happens then, as you know, the 5 years got up this February, on February 5th, and the treaty expired. And a part of why the treaty expired is the stuff that I just told you about what happened in the previous Trump administration. It's because this administration does not think that the New START treaty was a good deal. It thinks that China should be within the framework of any new deal that happens on arms control. Now, Russia has said as of January and February, and even after the treaty has expired, that it will continue to adhere to the New START treaty for 1 more year, right? We're still waiting to hear back what the United States is going to do, but indications are that the United States is not going to commit to any such unilateral 1-year extension, right? So that said, President Trump has made claims about wanting to make the world a safer place. He has multiple times talked about how he finds nuclear weapons to be scary and those weapons should be destroyed, and that he wants to get a better deal on nuclear weapons. right? So if he wants to negotiate a better treaty, you might think maybe there's an opportunity here. And we'll come to that in a second. But for now, while the US administration tries to figure out what a better deal might be, what the framework might be, and who might be within that deal, we've got a world which has no guardrails for an arms race. And we've got a world where nuclear modernization now is really going to ramp up. And when I say nuclear modernization is going to ramp up, I don't just mean the adversaries of the United States. I mean the United States itself as well, right? So let's look at Russia first. Russia has talked about 3 major systems that it has really wanted to develop over the last decade. And over the last decade, at different points in time, we have found examples of pieces of information that have come out about these systems. The first system, which was tested very recently, is the Burevestnik system. The Burevestnik system is a nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable, which means that it can carry nuclear weapons. It's a cruise missile that can carry nuclear weapons, and it will be nuclear-powered. It can apparently fly for 15 hours. No cruise missile in the world can fly for 15 hours at this point. So it tells you that this is a major leap in technology if, in fact, it has been achieved. According to Russia, of course, it has been achieved because as of October 2025, they announced that, yes, we tested this system and it flew for 14 kilometers, right? Sorry, it flew for 14 hours. That's a typo there. Now, the next system is Poseidon. Poseidon is a nuclear-powered underwater torpedo which is equipped with a nuclear weapon. So it's essentially a drone that is nuclear-powered, that has a nuclear weapon on it. Now, how many of you have seen The Diplomat?
Yes, I was just going to say.
That's the one. Yep, exactly. Season 3. This is what we're talking about. If you haven't seen The Diplomat, you might check it out. And this is a bit of a spoiler, so apologize for it. But the Poseidon will make an appearance, so it's kind of exciting. You know what happens, so I won't let away. Absolutely. Take a look. It's scary. The people in the show are scared. We should be scared. The missile could, in fact, devastate entire coastal regions by creating radioactive tsunamis when detonated. That's what this missile is meant to do. So there's that. And then finally, if that wasn't enough, we've got the Avant-Garde system. And the Avant-Garde system is a nuclear-capable hypersonic boost glide vehicle. What this means is that you know how a ballistic missile takes off, goes into ballistic trajectory, comes back into Earth, right? So it has to follow this ballistic trajectory. That's why it's a ballistic missile. A hypersonic boost vehicle does not have to follow a ballistic trajectory. So you could launch it. It could fly much closer to the Earth's to the Earth, and it could be maneuverable. And not only that, this missile is supposed to fly at 20 times the speed of sound. So when we get rid of arms control agreements, I want us to think of the things that we enable, right? And these are the sort of things that a New START treaty would not have allowed to be built. So we've got to think about that. What's this going to do for the United States? Now, I'll speak less about this because I suspect some of you have read about Golden Dome already. Golden Dome is one of the primary goals of the Trump administration. The idea is, if any of you remember the Strategic Defense Initiative from the mid-80s, the idea is that you're going to have around the Earth space-based interceptors, maybe lasers, which will be able to intercept incoming ballistic missiles at any point in time. Now, this sounds slightly fantastical. In the 1980s, we were calling it Star Wars. We've not given Golden Dome we haven't given it a movie moniker yet. But it's pretty fantastical, perhaps fantastical as some of the other stuff that we've been talking about. But this is definitely one of the things that the United States is building. The other things that the United States is building, and this is going to be of interest to you sitting here in Colorado, is that there are new land-based Sentinel systems, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles that are being built, and those silos are going to be in Colorado, in northern Colorado. So if any of you know where the Minutemen missiles are, those will now be sort of phased out once the Sentinel missiles are ready. They are extremely expensive, and they've been taking a lot of time to come online. But I am told they will be ready soon. And when they do, these will be the new systems that are deployed for the United States. There's a new strategic bomber being built. So the B-2 bomber is being replaced by the B-21 Raider, which is also a stealth bomber. There is also new ballistic missile submarines being built. The Columbia-class submarines are being built right now. The thing is, with some of the United States modernization, some of this stuff has been on the books for about a decade, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that when the New START treaty was signed, President Obama had to cut a deal with Congress to get the treaty ratified. The deal was the $1 trillion nuclear modernization, right? So once you have a deal for arms control and you decide to modernize your entire nuclear delivery systems, what happens is, if I'm your adversary, I might sit and think, they're saying they want arms control, they've bought themselves 10 years, but they seem to be putting $1 trillion into nuclear modernization. I don't know how I feel about this. Maybe I should build myself some more modern nuclear systems. So that's potentially where the Russians were coming from. But we are in this world. The United States can now build these systems. They can build these systems at scale. The other thing, by the way, that the United States can potentially do, if there was an intention to do this, is that they can put additional warheads on existing missile systems. So not all the missiles on the Ohio-class nuclear submarines are maxed out. It's not at maximum capacity, because there were limits on the number of deployments that you could have up till now. Because now you don't have those limits, you could have more missiles. So let's think about that. Now, could there be a new arms control treaty, right? Because remember what I told you about what President Trump said earlier this February. We are going to negotiate a better deal. I would not hold my breath. Why not? Because it's not only about Russia. It's also about China. Right? So China is in this arms control mix, whether we like it or not, and whether they like it or not. So the total number of warheads that we know that China has right now is 600. The DoD projects that there are going to be 1,000 warheads that China is going to have by 2030. And by 2035, China is going to have 1,500 nuclear warheads. Now, these projections, of course, are extremely scary. China also has a nuclear triad, which means that it can launch its nuclear weapons from air, land, and sea. In 2021, we found out that China had built 3 more nuclear missile fields. So silos, essentially, which could potentially house 300 missiles, which are ICBMs. Of course, Beijing said that these were all wind farms, so it's fine. But we have some reason to be concerned, because about 5 years ago, we thought China had about 350 to 400 nuclear weapons. Today, the latest reporting is that it has about 600 nuclear weapons. So what does that mean? For the United States, the argument is, and this is the argument that's coming out from DoD as well as the administration, and by the way, this is a bipartisan argument. This is not an argument that's being made just by Republicans or just by Democrats. Both sides are making this argument, is that the United States is now looking at not only Russia as a peer nuclear competitor, it's also looking at China as a peer nuclear competitor. So let's look at that claim, though, right? Is China a nuclear peer competitor? By the way, China also in 2021 conducted 2 hypersonic weapons tests. And so those boost glide vehicles that I was telling you about, the ones that go at 20 times the speed of sound and can be maneuvered with nuclear weapons on top of them, China is also potentially developing them. But I would argue to you that China is not a nuclear peer. Right? And some of this data is coming out of the Federation of American Scientists who monitor the nuclear arsenals of every state and put out reports on where those arsenals are, how much fissile material each country has, who's building new things, right? China is not a nuclear peer state because today we know that China has about 600 nuclear warheads. The United States has 3,700 nuclear warheads. We are not comparable, right, at this point. The United States has qualitative and fundamental quantitative advantages over China still. And even if China were to have 1,000 nuclear weapons, the United States would still have a massive advantage. Okay? So it is not a peer competitor. Is it improving its qualitative and quantitative abilities? Absolutely. The other thing we need to remember is that China does have a no first use policy. Now, there are many folks who don't necessarily believe this no first use policy, right? What is a no first use policy? A no first use policy is when I say, look, I have nuclear weapons, I'm never going to use nuclear weapons first, right? Sure, but when you threaten me and I see something really bad is about to happen, am I going to stand by my word? Not necessarily. But it is an orienting part of China's policy, which means that it isn't building first strike weapons necessarily. It's not building a lot of short-range nuclear weapons that can be fired really fast and can hit the adversary really fast. The United States has those weapons. The Russians, of course, have those weapons. There are some other states which do have those weapons. China is not focusing on that right now. China does not have the most diverse nuclear force. It's primarily dependent on ICBM silos. It has a small SSBN force with 6 SSBNs, which are nuclear submarines, which can carry ballistic missiles. And its bomber force is in very, very early stages. Right? The things that China is worried about is AUKUS. One of the ways that the United States and the UK and Australia have decided to try and check China is by giving Australia conventionally armed but nuclear-powered submarines. And so these submarines will be able to be out at sea for a very long time, will be very silent, but they will be conventionally armed. Now, if you're China, you might sit here and think, that looks a little threatening to me. Pillar 2 of AUKUS has all these technologies, right? So quantum technologies, AI technology, which the United States is sharing with its partners, not just Australia, but with a number of partners across East Asia, right? And so these will include hypersonic and counter-hypersonic capabilities, electronic warfare, and broader information sharing. So what we are coming to here is a sort of competition in the Indo-Pacific. Right now, we've moved away a little bit from the Russia-US competition, and we are looking at just China-US competition. And in China-US competition, this is what's worrying China. Meanwhile, this and this is what is worrying the United States. Right? So we are in this world of what we would call the security dilemma, where you see a country building up, a country that is an adversary, building up certain weapon systems. You try to check that because you think you're being defensive. And I would argue AUKUS is potentially a defensive move. But the problem with defensive moves is that your adversary might think of them as being offensive moves. And the minute your adversary thinks of it as being an offensive move, you're in trouble because then you have to respond. Right? So that's a security dilemma. But the US and China are not the only actors with nuclear weapons in this region. India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons, right? So you've also got to think of now this world where the United States, of course, is going through its massive nuclear modernization, close to $2 trillion of modernization as things stand today. China is responding to that, right? So that's where those numbers of 1,000 by 2030 come from. That's where the 350 to 600 numbers come from. But let's think of who are China's other nuclear adversaries. India, right? In 2020, you had a massive sort of fight between India in this region of Ladakh. India shares a huge border dispute with China along the eastern sector over here and the northern sector over here. And India has about, to the best of our knowledge, 171 nuclear weapons or 172 nuclear weapons these days. China has about 600. They are fighting each other, and they have fought each other more recently than the US and China has fought each other, which isn't recent at all, hasn't really happened. But every time India looks at China's missile silos, India feels a little more insecure, right? So what's India doing? India is, and I've written about this, India is now building a new restructured rocket force for just conventional missiles. Now, it hopes that these conventional missiles will help it counter the Chinese threat along the border, along the disputed border. At the same time, it is feeling vulnerable. It's feeling more vulnerable to China, just as China may be feeling vulnerable to the United States. Who else is India in an adversarial relationship with? Pakistan. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Pakistan has about 170 nuclear weapons. Pakistan has air-based nuclear weapons, Pakistan has land-based nuclear weapons, and potentially sea-based nuclear weapons, not on submarines, but sea-based cruise missiles that are nuclear capable. If you're Pakistan and you're looking at India building a new rocket structure and trying to up its defenses against China, you're also thinking, hey, those weapon systems could come towards me. So you're building up. So what I'm saying is that there is a cascade effect here. United States modernization, China modernization, India modernization, Pakistan modernization, right? And this is the world we are living in today. This is, if you study nuclear weapons, this is your everyday, right? What new things are being tested? But beyond that, and I won't dwell on this too much because I want to move on and very quickly talk about Iran and end the talk. The Indo-Pacific today has missiles of all kinds being sent to each other, right? Like India is sending the BrahMos missile, which it co-developed with Russia. So the Bra is from Brahmaputra, which is a river, and Mos is from Moscow. It's a supersonic cruise missile. You've got South Korea testing submarine-launched ballistic missiles, potentially thinking about building nuclear weapons themselves. Japan has been mass-producing long-range missiles and hypersonic ballistic missiles. Taiwan has been acquiring cruise missiles, short-range, and air defense missiles. North Korea, of course, continues its ballistic missile development. If you were following the news today, Kim Jong-un just said that the United States should just come out and recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, so then it can make peace with the fact that North Korea wants to have now anti-satellite weapon systems as well as nuclear submarines with ballistic missiles in them. Australia is bolstering its nuclear-capable cruise missile systems. India has a new missile force, as I talked to you about. Pakistan has new cruise missiles and ballistic missile systems as well, and a new rocket command. So we're in a world of nuclear proliferation, which you might have guessed already, but I'm just hammering the point in. In this world of nuclear proliferation, we've also got other problems. What are our other problems? Since 2020, we've got the United States sort of talking to its allies in not very reassuring terms. When I'm thinking about allies, I'm thinking about allies in Europe who think about Russia every morning. And I'm also thinking about Japan and South Korea, right, who think about China very regularly. So these countries are now thinking, well, if the United States is not going to stand up and defend us or stand by its NATO commitments, then what do we do? So you have countries like Poland talking about making nuclear weapons, right? You have the UK and France saying, well, maybe we'll have to then extend a nuclear umbrella to Europe. But they can't do that with the forces that they have. They would have to fundamentally modernize their nuclear systems. That would be nuclear proliferation. Now, if you're South Korea, and where, by the way, 70% of the South Korean population is in favor of building nuclear weapons. if you're South Korea and you are feeling anxious not only about North Korea, but also China, and about the fact that the United States may not be a good partner and may not come and stand up for you, you might think, well, I've got massive popular support. Should I build nuclear weapons? I've got submarine-launched ballistic missiles already. Right? And if you're Japan, you might not want to be too far behind South Korea. So this is the world on another side that we are talking about here, right? So within this context of nuclear proliferation, we come to Iran. And as you know about the Iran deal, I won't spend too much time on this. 2015 is when the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was signed. Iran, the P5+1, and EU. And the JCPOA capped Iranian uranium enrichment at 3.67%. Weapons-grade uranium is 90%. So it is pretty early down the line. And with 3.67, you can produce, obviously, nuclear power, but you can't really do weapons development with that nuclear enrichment level. The stockpile was to be stopped at 300 kilograms for 15 years. The Iranians were meant to dispose of excess enriched uranium, and most importantly, they gave access to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, which was going to monitor this entire setup. Of course, and then there was 25 years of oversight, which was meant to be by a joint commission, including all the signatory states. This, of course, broke down. 2018 is when the United States withdraws from the JCPOA, and President Trump, of course, calls it a horrible one-sided deal. Some of the concerns around the Iranian nuclear program at that point of time, which is what we are discussing right now with the negotiations that are going on, was that the JCPOA did not cover ballistic missiles. So nuclear delivery systems were not covered by the JCPOA. And there was also concern that Iran could, when the JCPOA deal ended in 10 to 15 years, that Iran could potentially resume its nuclear program. So the JCPOA would not have just finished the Iranian nuclear program, but it would have considerably stalled the process, right? So 2018, the JCPOA, the United States withdraws from it, maximum pressure policy of the United States starts, and by 2020, Iran increases uranium enrichment to 20%. It, of course, goes way beyond 20% after that. So that's where we are today, right? Now, these negotiations essentially started in 2021 under the Biden administration, which tried to bring Iran back to the table and sign some form of the JCPOA, which would be a new Iran nuclear deal. That did not happen under the Biden administration. So then we have President Trump's administration come in and resume negotiations. So US Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff and the Iranian Prime Minister Abbas Araghchi hold talks in 2025, middle of last year. The talks revolve around Iran limiting its nuclear program in exchange for the United States lifting sanctions. By June 2025, talks do not progress enough, and you have Operation Midnight Hammer, which is essentially the United States sending across stealth bombers, which are also nuclear capable, by the way, but thankfully they were just carrying conventional weapon systems, and they hit these 3 nuclear enrichment facilities, these 3 major nuclear facilities. And at that point of time, the United States administration says that it has decimated the Iranian nuclear program. Of course, within a few weeks, the IAEA chief comes out and says, well, we still think that the Iranian nuclear program is there. It's also possible that about 400 kilograms of enriched uranium, 60% and above. Remember, 90% is weapons grade. 60% is pretty high and pretty close to weapons grade. 400 kilograms of that was potentially removed from these facilities to a secure location. We don't know where. So these counterproliferation strikes were not necessarily successful, or as successful as the United States had initially assumed or hoped. So here we are, right? there is this now big debate on, do you have dialogue or do you just go in for a military strike? The photo that you see on your right is what we know of from the public sources that we have of what United States forces have been amassed on or in and around the Persian Gulf. And it is a huge force. The question is the United States now looking for a full rollback of the Iranian nuclear program? If that's the case, then that's a very high standard to meet, which is not to say they can't meet it, but it's just a very high standard. Is the United States going to be okay with a token amount of enrichment? Now, I'm thinking here something like the JCPOA, 3.67% was a token amount of enrichment. Would the United States under the Trump administration agree to something of that sort? Right? Can they actually couple nuclear and missile technology? Because Iranians in the past have been very clear that they do not want those two things coupled. There's also this question of, are military strikes actually effective tools? Right? So if we go beyond dialogue and we think about the possibility of striking Iran militarily, what are you going to do that for? Are you going to do it for regime change? Which you could, but what if a new regime does not roll back the nuclear program? What if the new regime is not necessarily in line with the United States? And are you concerned, or should we be concerned, that any kind of military action at this point in time, where things are so tense, might actually push Iran closer towards the bomb? This is from 3 hours ago. Chief negotiators Witkoff and Kushner with the Omani, is it foreign minister? Yes, the foreign minister of Oman, who's negotiating these talks in Geneva right now. But the talks wrapped up today, at least, with no announcement of a deal. They're still talking. The United States has not walked away. But that's where we are. With that, I'm going to end this part of the talk, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
I have two questions. How many nuclear-armed countries are in the world now? Is it 9 plus the 2, Iran and Poland? And explain to me how the math works with hypersonic missiles that can go 14,000 miles an hour in an Earth that's 24,000 miles in circumference and do it for 15 hours.
Perfect. Those are. Thank you for that question, for both questions. Let me take the easier one first, which is the second question. You got to ask the Russians that, right? This is, we of course read every press conference statement that's put out with a great amount of skepticism in general, but sometimes we read certain statements with greater skepticism than usual. And this is one of those, right? As you say, the matter is rather confusing and questionable, is probably the most polite way to put it. How many nuclear countries do we have in the world? We have 9 nuclear countries. We've got we've got the United States, the Soviet Union, and then Russia, which tested right after. You've got the United Kingdom. You've got France. You've got China, of course. You've got India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. Those are your nuclear countries, right? Now you've got, as you say, Iran is a country that has potential to build nuclear weapons. It does not have nuclear weapons to the best of our knowledge, right? So it's just those 9 countries right now. But there are a number of countries that we think of as potential proliferator states, right? Countries that might think about building nuclear weapons at a very short notice and have the capability to do so. Those countries are Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, potentially Turkey. So we are worried that if Iran gets the bomb, then Saudi Arabia might think about potentially getting the bomb, right? So those are some countries that we think of in the nuclear world, at least, as being potential proliferators. Thanks.
Thank you for being here, Professor. It's impressive how current your slides were, especially at the end. Two questions. Is it very difficult enriching from 3.67% to 90%? And then the second question is, why have they been so late in the game?
Right. Thank you for those questions. So for the first question, how difficult is it to go from 3.67 to 90%? In the way that enrichment works, going from 3.67 to 20% takes a long time, right? That's the bulk of the time that it might take to go towards weaponization. From 20% to 90% might take about 6 to 8 months. So what you really want to try and do is to try and curb a nuclear program on the early side. You definitely don't want a nuclear program to cross 10%, and you want to try and keep it closest to zero. To that extent, 3.67 was a decent number. Now, when you hear about nuclear breakout, people often use the term nuclear breakout. They could have breakout in 6 months. That means that they're anywhere between that 20% to that 90% enrichment level. And this is assuming that they have uranium. You need to get uranium first before you move towards a plutonium system, but that's a different issue altogether. Now, with regard to your second question, could you tell me just revert the question again?
Why has China been so late in the nuclear?
Right. So I don't think China has been late to the nuclear game, right? I think once there was obviously there, you might ask the question of why did China test in 1964? I think at that point in time, China was just not technologically advanced enough to have an entire nuclear weapons apparatus. Of course, it got a fair amount of help from the Soviet Union before they had a falling out, right? So then it tests in 1964. Between 1964 and now, China has actually believed in this policy of credible minimum deterrence. Now, credible minimum deterrence says that you don't need 10,000 nuclear weapons. You don't need 50,000 nuclear weapons. You just need to have enough nuclear weapons that can be credibly fired upon your adversary, and that should be enough to deter them from acting towards you, right? So now I might ask you, if I'm China and I have 350 nuclear weapons, and I am sure that I can cover the major United States cities with those. So I'm not going to go through a list of cities, but I'll think of at least 4 major cities, right? DC, New York, Chicago, LA. If I can take care of all of those cities and I can hit them multiple times over, do I need anything more than that? So that's credible minimum deterrence. That's, by the way, not just China. It's also what India and Pakistan talk about, which is why they haven't really India and Pakistan haven't crossed the 200 threshold yet. China held strong at a low number for a very long time, which is why there's concern that once the United States' $1 trillion modernization plan came into place, both Russia and China made substantial changes in their nuclear programs. And that's probably one of the reasons that we're looking at a different nuclear policy from China than it had even 10 years ago. Thank you. Of course.
Hi. So if Iran's major purpose is deterrent so that we don't bomb them, the actual bombing of them, wouldn't they be more proof that they need nuclear weapons for deterrent?
It could be, right? If you are in a situation where you're Iran and you think, and I don't know what the Supreme Leader thinks of deterrence theory, right? I don't know if the Supreme Leader thinks that if I have nuclear weapons, I will be able to deter the United States. But I can imagine that that's one of the arguments that might be floated in that war room, that North Korea developed nuclear weapons and they've not had anyone bomb them, right? Whereas, if you think about Iraq and Libya, they did. Those thoughts might be in Iranian policymaking circles, right? We should assume that they're looking at all those options. So we've got to think about what is the best way to ensure that that doesn't happen, right? The nuclearization of Iran doesn't happen. And to my mind, dialogue is the best way. And so I'm glad that this dialogue is taking place in Geneva. I'm not as enthused about the military buildup. I hope that they don't have to be used.
I have two questions. You listed 4 missiles, and I think the first one, are they all from Russia? The first one started with an R, or whatever it was.
The Burevestnik.
As I recall, with this war between Ukraine and Russia, I think there was a missile that Russia sent, destroyed a city in instant, and it destroyed it and brought it to the ground. And I was horrified to hear that. And is that the missile they used? And how close are we to a third world war?
So that the reports were that a version of that missile was used, but the city was not fully destroyed, right? In the sense that the missile had conventional warheads on them. It was an attack that the Russians sort of came out and said, look, we've tested this missile system. It was meant to be a threat to Ukraine as well as the United States and NATO countries to stay away. And I would say some of that has, of course, been Russians trying to have show that they have had a greater impact than they actually have, which is par for the course. If you're Russia, you want to show greater impact. It was not clear to me that that missile that they claimed the Burevestnik was in fact that. It's not clear to me that it was a nuclear-powered missile necessarily, and that it was fully effective in the way that would credibly threaten Europe or the United States. On the Third World War question, I certainly hope that we are not anywhere close to it, but your guess is as good as mine.
Do you sleep at night?
I try. I certainly try.
The question is, if our government concludes that the only way to have Iran not be nuclear is to have a change in the government, is there any threat that you can think of that could bring change in the government short of our attacking?
Right, that is that's a difficult question. I'll venture an answer, and I'll say that I think that it's a very difficult proposition, right? Like, you could potentially, first of all, what do we think of being change in government? Do we mean taking out the Ayatollah? So do we change Iran from being a theocratic state? Is that regime change? Or is regime change a change in Iran's precedent? Right? So on either of those fronts, there could be succession plans. So you could have a potential decapitating strike, which the United States and Israel have done with other Iranian leaders. I'm thinking especially of Soleimani here, the general who was taken out. And you could do that, and you could still not necessarily affect regime change, right? So decapitation does not equal regime change. I'll just say that I think my main concern with this policy is that the regime change policies that the United States and its partners have undertaken in the Middle East, especially in North Africa, have just not gone very well in the long term. So the question is, can you have dialogue and can you live with an agreement which is more close to the JCPOA, which gives some kind of token enrichment ability, which allows some basic missile capabilities? And can you put just reins on that instead of going for the revolutionary approach, which is to sort of blow it up and then put it back together, right? And I don't know if one way is better than the other, but those are some musings on what an answer might be. Thanks.
Get this one in the
Yeah.
center.
So after World War II and the atomic age, the only thing that got us out from underneath the desk was the space age. Any hope?
Well, hope, yes, in the sense that I think we are uncovering and exploring newer technologies which are for sure going to advance our not only understanding of the world, but our understanding broadly of things beyond the world as well, right? In terms of, I'm thinking especially in terms of space travel and things like that. My concerns are the people who are, and corporations who are in charge of or have taken up the mantle of that kind of technological change at the moment, right? I think that the fundamental difference between that period right after the Second World War up till maybe the early 80s is that, yes, there were corporations, but the people who were taking humans to the moon were NASA, right? There was accountability. There was congressional oversight, Senate oversight, right? I am not sure to what extent the entities that are not NASA, who are sort of talking about exploring Mars and the rest of the solar system, what kind of oversight there is on them at the moment, right? Which means that there is a lack of public accountability around this broader question of what the space age holds for us. Because you're not the one who's shaping what the space age holds for us. Because the people you have put in government, in the legislature, in Congress, are not the people who can make those decisions anymore, right? So somehow it has become from being the promise of the space age, from being like for all mankind, has become for the few, right? And our input in a democratic society is minimal at best, if at all present. So that's what I worry about. But theoretically, I think it holds hope. I think programmatically how we deal with it has to be fundamentally different.
How do you think about Taiwan? Xi Jinping is a very serious, brilliant man, and he's made a very public claim that 2027 is Taiwan's limit.
Yeah.
Yet Taiwan is certainly not nuclear armed to the extent that we know. Do you see that as a regional skirmish and the rest of the world will stand by as a result because it doesn't seem worthy as a nuclear trigger for the major powers? What's your view?
That's another one of those things that we didn't cover in the talk, but it's a major concern, right? Across Washington, as well as you rightly pointed out, things that we've heard from China, there is an expectation that something's going to happen around Taiwan in 2027. And what are the options here, right? One option is that there is some sort of military move that China makes on Taiwan. Taiwan is by itself. It puts up a fight but cannot withstand the military pressure, and so it caves. China occupies Taiwan. That's one option, right? What is option two? Option two is China makes military move, Taiwan starts defending, the United States comes to its aid. Now that is potentially a trigger for two nuclear countries fighting each other for the first time in a very long time. Actually, not that long a time, because India and China both fought each other just 2020 and 2022. But that would be at a different scale altogether. That potentially would be a trigger for a larger war. That might come to the World War III territory that you asked me about. What are our other options? The other option is that China does not attack at all, right? Maybe it makes enough threats that there is some sort of ceding of sovereignty by Taiwan to China, if it feels that it is alone. Now, under the present US administration, there is a sense that a lot of America's allies are not feeling as safe as they used to be, right? So it's a question of, is it worth it, right, for the United States? And I think that's a question only the White House can give us, right? Because it seemed for a bit under the Biden administration, and I think this was a faux pas that happened at one of the Biden press conferences, where he said that, yes, we have a guarantee that we've given them and there's an alliance. I don't think that's right. There isn't officially an alliance, and the United States can easily decide that, hey, we don't want to be engaged in this massive fight because it's not in the US backyard. It is in China's backyard. If we are in this world where we care about spheres of influence, right? Where in the international relations world, we keep talking about, this was during the Cold War, this was in the US sphere of influence, and this was in the Soviet sphere of influence. Greenland is in the US sphere of influence. Venezuela is in the US sphere of influence. Taiwan is in China's sphere of influence. If this White House believes that, then we might not see a war at all between the US and China at the very least. Now that, of course, is not very enthusing if you're sitting in Taiwan, but it's just it's a terrible sort of geopolitical constellation that we're looking at right now, and we are just not sure which way things are going to go. Yeah, thanks.
Our next question's in back.
Any comment on the doomsday clock?
So the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists puts out a doomsday clock every year. It was at 89 minutes last year. This year it's a minute and a half closer, I think. And look, I think the doomsday clock does us such an immense service. And I say that because I think that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists puts together this board of experts who are experts of not only their fields within physics, chemistry, and the sciences, but also within the social sciences, looking at politics and policy. And they basically tell us how close we are to midnight, midnight being nuclear annihilation. And today, the doomsday clock is actually not just about how many threats a nuclear weapons country has made to each other, it's also about climate change, right? Because nuclear and climate are also deeply intertwined. The more nuclear weapons you have, the worse it is for the climate. Because if one of these weapons gets used, accidentally even, which by the way is also a possibility, then you're looking at a climate catastrophe. You're looking at famine. You're looking at deep changes in our ecosystem. And so, the Bulletin has been sort of moving the clock closer to midnight almost every year now. And if any of you aren't following, and I would say just look up the doomsday clock, and it is immensely scary. And at the same time, it gives you it's a barometer for where are we at? Are we in a safer world? And we certainly are not today. But we can always hope to turn the clock back towards the other side, right? Thanks.
I don't know if this fits in here, but what are theater nuclear weapons? How would they be used, and how destructive are they?
Right. So theater nuclear weapons and how destructive are they or how likely are they to be used? We came really close to potential nuclear use in 2022. In the fall of 2022, reports indicate that Russia, the Russians are taking a lot of hits around that time in Ukraine, and they were pushed very much to the wall, had seriously considered the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And the United States was involved very aggressively in attempts to ensure that that didn't happen. So we were very close. Now there's also a question of who else has tactical nuclear weapons beyond Russia. The United States has tactical nuclear weapons. Pakistan has tactical nuclear weapons, right? So there's a question of, India and Pakistan are often, every few years nowadays, we had a massive skirmish last May. We had 2019, there was a massive skirmish again, firefights, aircraft sort of firing on each other. And the concern always has been that Pakistan's nuclear policy is that they have something called, they've got this doctrine which is sort of a version of flexible response, which they're saying that, look, you could attack us with conventional weapons, but we reserve the right to use tactical nuclear weapons against you. So very often we worry about those weapon systems being within 60 kilometers of the border of India and in the hands of battlefield commanders who may or may not listen to what orders are coming in from Islamabad. And so those are concerns that we have. Are we close? Not right now and not today. So if that helps some of us at least sleep a little better at night. But tactical nuclear weapons are, in fact, I would say, extremely destructive. Why do I think I think the name tactical nuclear weapon is a slightly misleading name, because the expectation is that if you use a tactical nuclear weapon, which is, say, in the low kilotons, right? Say it's 2 kilotons or 3 kilotons. A kiloton is 1,000 tons of TNT, right? So we are talking 3,000 to 4,000 tons of TNT, which would be less than Hiroshima, which was 16 kilotons, right? But at the same time, you think about the use of one of these weapon systems if it was used in Ukraine near a city, or if it's used on the India-Pakistan border, it would not just be tactical, because tactical assumes that you've used this weapon system and you've used it against a military. You've used it against an adversary's battalion or military formation, and that's it. Strategic assumes that you've targeted civilians. But if you use this near a city, say in Ukraine, could you differentiate between a civilian and a combatant? You couldn't. There's actually studies about this, which the International Physicians Against Nuclear War, who actually won a Nobel Prize in the 80s, they've put out studies of what would happen if just a small number, 3 or 4 tactical nuclear weapons were used on the India-Pakistan border. And they came to the conclusion that if that does happen, even at low kilotonnage, you would have at least 1 billion people at risk, if not 2 billion people who might potentially die of famine. Not of nuclear, not from radiation necessarily. But this is where the climate and nuclear nexus comes into play, because it would affect the climate bad enough that you would have multiple crop failures across Asia. And when that happens, you're going to have famine. So that's why I think tactical nuclear weapons are, in fact, extremely dangerous, and you cannot always make a very clear distinction between tactical and strategic use.
More questions? No? Yes,
There's a
yes,
question
thank
there.
you, Lynn.
So just a comment about the gentleman's question about the destructiveness. So about 2 or 3 years ago, we visited the last existing Minuteman III missile silo in Green Valley, Arizona. It's about 40 miles south of Tucson, and you could take a tour of it. And during the tour, they still got a missile in the silo, obviously no warhead. but this missile's like 95 feet tall. It's like a 10-story building.
Right.
And the guy, I was asking, well, how big was the warhead? He said, well, it carried a 50 megaton warhead, so 50 million tons of TNT. And he said if you launched it into the Southern California area and it went off, it would take out all of Los Angeles, Long Beach, San Bernardino, everything for like 1,000 square miles. Gone. I mean, it would just vaporize it. So that gives you an idea.
Right, and not only that, let me add to that I don't know how many of you know about the Damascus incident. Is there anybody here who knows about the Damascus incident? Okay, so there's a fantastic book by an author named Eric Schlosser, who actually was a finalist for the Pulitzer for this book. The book is called Command and Control. And in that book, Eric Schlosser, who's an author and a filmmaker, who was actually at the University of Denver at the Corbell School last year to give a talk. In this book, he talks about the Damascus incident. And the Damascus incident happened in the late 1980s in Arkansas. And it was just like you described. There was a silo with a 3 megaton warhead on it. And there was routine maintenance going on in the silo. From on top of the missile, one of the technicians basically had a wrench slip from their hand. Now, you mentioned how tall those missiles are. So it gathers momentum, ricochets off the silo, hits the fuel compartment, and it explodes. It's a massive explosion. And for a while, it wasn't clear if the warhead was going to go off or not. And then, of course, thankfully the warhead didn't go off. There were fatal fatalities. I think a couple of people died. At least one person definitely died. And that was a massive nuclear accident that happened here in the United States. And the United States, which, by the way, has the highest transparency and potentially some of the safest mechanisms of trying to keep nuclear weapons and the apparatus around it safe. And even so, this is not the only example, right? If anybody goes to the aerospace museum that's in the Lowry area of Denver, there's a B-1 bomber right there. And right in front of that B-1 bomber, there's just a very little folder of accidents around nuclear weapons. And that folder has way too many pages for anyone to be able to sleep safely at night. So, yeah, and those are just accidents that we know of that the United States was potentially involved in. There's other accidents as well that we either don't know of and definitely in other countries. All right, anyone else?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So nice
Thank
to
you
have
so
you.
much.
Thank you.